So I'm going to be talking about Ghost River, but it's sort of a two for the price of one kind of talk, because we're also going to be talking about my digital humanities project, Digital Paxton, from which this emerged. And we'll be talking a little bit more broadly about the sort of settler colonial history behind these stories. You'll find my email address and my Twitter handle. If you want to get in touch with me afterwards, I'm happy to share these slides. They're a little chunky. There's a lot of images, as you'll see, but I'm happy to share them via Google Drive. So let's rewind a little bit. Imagine it's December 1763. You're now all Pennsylvanians. Welcome. Where you live in the colony of Pennsylvania. There is an unsteady, very fragile peace after many years of war, the 7 Years' War, which on the American continent we know as the French and Indian War, sort of proxy war between England and France, with indigenous peoples and settler colonists sort of playing in a very complicated way, often with their own intentions. And those intentions are sometimes in tension with the imperial ambitions of these larger empires. At this point, as you can see from this map, the Crown of England really controls, in a very sort of tenuous way, land stretching all the way from Nova Scotia down to New Orleans. But it's, again, a very tenuous grasp on that land. And they have incurred a great deal of debt over the past decade of warfare. And particularly in the mid-Atlantic region, Pennsylvania, the boundaries between the country and the back country, as it was called then, the borderlands, are very porous and contested. And there are a lot of settlers inhabiting these lands that had been reserved for the quote unquote Indians at this point. There was a resurgence of violence in the summer with Pontiac's War, which was a pan-indigenous revival movement. And that carried as far into the colony of Pennsylvania as Pittsburgh, or Fort Pitt at that time. And there were a number of militiamen that had been trained up in the preceding years with the 7 Years' War. And some of them, the ones that we're going to talk about today, were from the Paxton Township. And this is where they get the name the Paxton Boys, which I think is a little bit infantilizing. This is a group of former militiamen that decided unprovoked to attack an unarmed group of native peoples called the Conestoga people. Now, the Conestoga people are extraordinary in the sense that they resided on a plot of land that was set aside by William Penn with the very founding of Pennsylvania. This is Conestoga Manor. So to attack these people who had English names, wore English dress, traded with nearby settlers, was a really provocative and political act. And so this brings us to the two attacks that often get conflated when scholars talk about this, the Paxton Massacres of 1763. The first being at Conestoga Indian Town, where a mob of these vigilantes from the Paxton Township murdered 6 men, women, and children at Conestoga Indian Town, burned the village, and desecrated the bodies. And then 2 weeks later, they pursued the fleeing Conestoga, who were taken in for so-called protection at the Lancaster jail. So on 2 days after Christmas, December 27th, 1763, this mob descended on the jail and massacred 14 remaining Conestoga, 8 of whom were children. And they did it in daylight, and they did it as a public act. And then they vowed to march on Philadelphia, where the proprietors, the Penn family, who were still in power, had taken 140 Lenape, so-called Moravian Indians, because of their sort of ongoing diplomacy with Moravian missionaries, so Philadelphia had taken 140 of these people into its borders, but really on the outskirts. There's often a sense that this is all happening inside the city limits of Philadelphia. That's very much a misunderstanding. They were first held at Province Island, which is today where the Philadelphia airport is. And later they were moved up to the barracks up in Northern Liberties. So never within the city limits of Philadelphia. These two images give you a sense of sort of the historical skew that happens with a lot of this history. First, the one on the left depicts the Paxtons as Jacksonian Democrats, really, by the top hats, murdering Western Indians, not Conestoga Indians, at the Lancaster jail. This is James Wimmer's lithograph from the 1840s, and this often gets circulated with a lot of the other material from this period. And then the other engraving to the right, the Paxton Expedition, is the first interior view, as we know it, of Philadelphia. But it shows the Paxtons descending on Philadelphia when in fact they were stopped in Germantown. And they were met by a delegation led by Benjamin Franklin and a militia that persuaded them to disband and to publish their grievances. This started what is often considered the first major pamphlet war of Pennsylvania. People think about the Stamp Act crisis a year later. They think about the American Revolution, but this pamphlet war really gives you all of the contours, the shape, the generic diversity of print that circulates. And pamphlets at this period were really like social media today. They were often published anonymously or pseudonymously. They often repackaged, retweeted, you could say, one another in mischaracterized positions. They were cheap to produce, and they could be produced very quickly. And so they circulated with great rapidity throughout 1764. And some scholars have looked at the sheer quantity of material pertaining to the Paxton incident. And the best estimate based on the material that circulated Pennsylvania is that 1/5 of all printed material in 1764 pertained to this particular incident. And it starts with a debate about the conduct of these Paxton vigilantes, whether or not they were justified in what they did. But it quickly becomes a much larger debate about Philadelphia, the Quaker elites, and whether or not they were fit to govern at this time, whether or not the Penn family was in any place to govern, or whether or not they needed to be replaced by, royalization through the crown. And it ensnares just about all of the major figures that we later associate with the American Revolution, including Hugh Williamson, who signed the Constitution, and Benjamin Franklin, who actually publishes the very first pamphlet in this pamphlet war, the narrative of the late massacres. And while he sort of aligns himself in defense of the Conestoga people, it's on terms that might make us uncomfortable today. It's really about hospitality rights, what is owed to these Native peoples as guests in the colony of Pennsylvania, and the fact that these vigilantes are disturbing the law and order of the colony. So a very strange kind of defense, but the Declaration and Remonstrance was published by the Paxton leaders, and shortly thereafter, the conduct of the Paxton men, impartially considered, really shifts the debate inside of Philadelphia away from one about the actual violence that the Paxton vigilantes had committed, and towards a much larger debate about violence in the Pennsylvania borderlands, and whether or not Quakers were fit to govern in these warring times. I created Digital Paxton with a number of partners, and really at the center of this work was an archival question. I knew that folks could find these materials if they could go through Redex early American imprints. If they had institutional credentials, they knew what to search for, they could find black and white predominantly scans of these materials. Other folks have relied upon an existing critical edition by John Rain Dunbar that's now 65 years old. And it makes a lot of very strong decisions about exactly what is and isn't worth studying in the context of this pamphlet war. Dunbar, for his part, identifies 28 of the pamphlets that he considers most interesting. But really, my goal with Digital Paxton was to create a different kind of edition, one that would be contingent and polyvocal rather than definitive. So he collects all of the pamphlets that Dunbar identifies and provides in full text, but it also makes them available in terms of scans, so you can acknowledge the materiality, which I'll show you in a moment is very important, but also all of the other pamphlets that he didn't deem important enough or exemplary enough to include in his edition, and all of the other materials that circulated alongside those pamphlets. Those could include political cartoons, which are really, really interesting, broadsides or broadsheets that would have been posted in taverns and in coffee houses, artwork, books that were published about this after the fact, and of course, all of the other pamphlets that he didn't consider extraordinary enough. It also includes a number of interpretive materials by other scholars that have different sort of perches, different questions that they're asking of these materials, including folks working in visual culture, Native American studies, history. I'm a lit scholar by training. And each one of those essays sort of serves as an entry point into this collection of materials. The idea being that the very structure of this collection, which is built in Scalar, is path-based. So there are different paths that you can take through this collection that surface different kinds of ambiguities, different kinds of uncertainties that destabilize the entire corpus of material, which is now pretty considerable, about 3,000 pages. And of course, finally, teaching materials, lots and lots of teaching materials for not only university faculty, but also high school and middle school teachers, thinking about how to integrate this with the Common Core curriculum. The contributing partners, I'd be remiss if I didn't draw attention to them because there are 24 now. It started with the support of the Library Company of Philadelphia, which has an amazing print collection, and the neighboring Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which has an extraordinary manuscript collection. And this gave a wonderful down payment on this collection. But over the past 5 years, we've added some 24 other cultural heritage institutions. Some are quite large and have already digitized those materials, but they're sort of siloed in the various repositories. So for example, Library of Congress, they digitize everything. Very easy to find that material. But if you're thinking about the Presbyterian Historical Society, the Pennsylvania State Archives out in Harrisburg, Lancaster History, these are really small institutions that unless you're a scholar and you have the resources to go visit them, you might not know that these materials are available. So at every turn, I've tried to cast the widest possible net to collect those materials, but then to always point people back to those libraries, archives, and cultural heritage institutions, because I want people to have the same experience that I had in discovering these materials, and potentially to identify things that I haven't even thought to include. So, of course, normalizing all of this across digital Paxton involved a lot of careful consideration about scanning standards so that they were consistent across all of the different institutions, setting up memoranda of understanding to ensure that all the materials are hosted in a way that is sustainable for at least 10 years. And of course, normalizing the metadata, making sure that we're supplying the same sort of information about these records so that everybody can easily identify what's coming from which repository. What I think is crucial about all of this is as you start to navigate this, even if you're focused on just the print debate, you realize how important it is to attend to the visual culture inside of that print debate. On the far left, you see an engraving that is nested inside of one of the pamphlets. This wouldn't have been identifiable using the Dunbar edition because, of course, it was just full text. It wasn't about the fact that there's this caricature of this vociferous Paxton ally, David James Dove, included with this pamphlet. That's an editorial decision that destabilizes the very reading of that pamphlet. There are also political cartoons that often accompany pamphlets or that pamphlets emerge from referring back to. So again, it's like trying to read through a series of social media posts without understanding the referent if you don't have all of these materials together. And of course, the broadsheets, which would have been posted in taverns and coffee houses, that would have been really giving you a sense of how the authority figures, the Penn family in particular, were responding to this crisis as it unfolded over almost 18 months. But I think what's really important and where the project's really leaned over the past several years is towards manuscript material. And that includes letters, diaries, and treaty minutes. And those give you a better sense of the texture of this experience as it unfolded, the debate, the way that memory sort of changes even as people are remembering it in these diaries. And of course, the disjuncture often between the treaty minutes in manuscript form and the ones that are published later and that circulate so widely. And those treaty minutes are complicated documents because you also have to understand that they have their own vantage point. They're often kept by Quakers or Moravians, and they give you a better sense of how they want to present themselves rather than necessarily their trading partners. Here are a few examples to give you a sense of this. Here's one from George Mason, as in Mason and Dixon. This is his diary that's available at Lancaster History. And about a year after this whole incident, he recollects what unfolded in Lancaster at the attack at the jail. And, the first thing he goes to is that it's stunning to him that the Crown didn't mobilize troops in defense of these native peoples. And he sees that as something to condemn. He ends no honor to them. But of course, he's also repeating the very narrative that circulated in print the previous year, that this was a party of 50 people that went inside of the jail and did this terrible deed inside, when in fact, historians have proven that this was actually an event that happened outside of the jail, intended for public consumption. This brings us also to the fact that they often destabilize the printed records that we take for granted as official authority, right? This is a wonderful set of records at the Pennsylvania State Archives. They're called the Papers of the Conestoga Manor. Remember, the Conestoga Manor is that plot of land set aside by William Penn at the very founding of Pennsylvania, on which Conestoga Indian Town was situated. And the caretaker for that entire manor, Jacob Whistler, is writing to one of his friends in Philadelphia, William Peters, about what's happening at Conestoga Indian Town. And he writes that families are already moving in, and they are related to the Paxtons themselves. He says that they're related to the Scots family of Donegal. That is code for the Paxton boys, the vigilantes. Their families are moving in, and when he goes to tell them that they have no claim to this land, they respond that they had possession and would keep it and would lose their lives before they would be turned off the land. And they care for no governor, sheriff, nor any other officer, and will allow no other person or persons to settle there without themselves. This directly confronts the narrative that the Paxton leaders put out in their pamphlet. They said that this is all about democratic representation. They're, poor backcountry settlers that have faced the brunt of the warfare in the borderlands. And that all that they did was they were seeking to protect their families. And then they would immediately go home and they just want to, have some representation in the government. Clearly here it's a land grab. And this is just 3 months after this terrible incident. And finally, and importantly, some of these records can help to center Native experiences. This is a wonderful set of records that were maintained by Moravian missionaries, and they're at the Moravian Archives of Bethlehem. And these Moravian missionaries kept these records. Of course, they're handwritten and they're also in German. So we had to transcribe them and translate them to make them most discoverable. But what they really give you is a sort of day-by-day account of the internment of the 140 Lenni Lenape who were interned around Philadelphia. And this particular passage gives you a sense of the migration they had to make with the arrival of the Paxton boys in Germantown, the migration they had to make from Province Island to the Philadelphia barracks in the dead of winter. And people are getting sick and people are dying on this passage. The missionaries themselves are struggling. And as they're passing past Philadelphia, they're hearing much bad talk from the people. And this, I think, helps to deflate this notion that Philadelphians were somehow united in support of these native peoples that were brought into their midst. In fact, it's a much more complicated and ugly story than that. And these diaries, I think, are crucial in showing that, puncturing that veneer, but also in really underscoring how long these Lenni Lenape were interned in and around Philadelphia. They were there for more than a year, and those diaries helped to expose that. So these kinds of records really bring us to the afterlife of Digital Paxton. And it really goes back to the title. As long as we're thinking about this as the Paxton incident, we're taking for granted that these vigilantes are the center of this story. And the question that I had as I was exploring more of these manuscript materials, talking with other scholars, is, was there a way for us to really tell the story of the Conestoga who get lost in this debate? The Lenni Lenape in Philadelphia who were interned, and also their kin who survived. And this really brings us to an archival problem. There hasn't been a lot of systematic collecting of indigenous materials, and where they are collected, they're mediated through colonists. Even the sort of well-intentioned colonists like the so-called, Quakers and Moravians, they have their own agenda, and they often use those records to tell their own story, to shape the public perception of their diplomacy. And so, as I was thinking about this project, I was really indebted to scholars working in Africana studies and Native American studies and thinking methodologically what this could look like. And I've given just a couple of gestures towards those scholars, one being Saidiya Hartman, who's going to be coming to the Stanford Humanities Center next week. And I would really encourage you all to see that. This is in a passage from Venus in Venus in Two Acts from Small Acts. And this gives you a sense of how she thinks about the archive, and the intent of the practice that she's describing is the practice of critical fabulation. And that is to imagine what cannot be verified, a realm of experience which is situated between two zones of death, social and corporal, and to reckon with the precarious lives which are only visible in the moment of their disappearance. It's a history written with and against the archive. So she's imagining that the archive tells some stories, but it also hides many. And so we have to really think about how to work in relation to that, how to integrate contemporary perspectives as well. Building upon her work is Marisa Fuentes. Her beautiful book, Dispossessed Lives, builds on this and really thinks about, okay, so scholars always talk about reading against the bias grain. She's saying, well, what happens if you read along it? And so I've highlighted one part here, like cutting fabric on the bias to create more elasticity. Reading along the bias grain expands the legibility of these archival documents to accentuate the figures of enslaved women present in society who are a spectral influence on the lives of white and Black men and women. Again, this is about thinking about the lives of enslaved peoples in the Americas and how difficult it is to discern the lived experience. But I think it's portable when we're thinking about archival fragments. And the archival fragments that Fuentes is really interested in would be like court proceedings, little fragments that she can use to sort of explore different ways of living in America. And so this finally brings us to Native scholars. Craig Womack, who is a Creek Cherokee scholar, has a wonderful book. It's now 20 years old, called Red on Red, American Indian Literary Separatism. And one of the key points that Womack makes is that Native literature, Native literary criticism can help advance the cause of tribal sovereignty. So these kinds of imaginative works, they have a real influence, and they need to be driven with cultural specificity, and they need to be driven by the Native peoples themselves. So it was with these types of theories in mind that we developed at the Library Company of Philadelphia the project, The Ghost River, The Fall and Rise of the Conestoga, which was supported by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, which meant that we had some resources to really see this forward, but it also meant we had a timeline that accompanied those resources, which has its own challenges, as I'll discuss a little later. I'm going to touch upon the central components of it, including the research and field work that we did with the author, artist, and the advisory team, as well as the teacher seminar that we convened with educators from all across the country. But really, the emphasis of this talk is going to be on the graphic novel and the digital edition that you can use to explore it today. And finally, I'll make sure that I wrap up with some discussion of the art exhibition that we hosted that I think really challenged the Library Company as sort of the colonial institution to really think differently about its presence and who belonged in that space. So briefly, in terms of the research and field work, this project started with me as a grad student hopping on a plane, cobbling together whatever funds I could find from my university and some outside funding to go out to Albuquerque. I flew out to Indigenous Comic-Con, which was then in its second year. I had been following a lot of Native artists and authors as I was thinking about this project. But, you know, it's not the same, you know, like writing emails to people, particularly when it's like a white guy reaching out to a Native community. It's not the same as actually showing up and having the conversation and stressing that this isn't my project. It's an idea that I would like to tackle, but I don't know what comes out the other side. That's what's so exciting about it. And that these creative team would really shape that. So the first images of Indigenous Comic-Con, I was dreadfully out of place. I showed up looking like this, and there are people in Wookiee costumes. And, you know, it was probably like the most spirited conference I've been to, and also one of the most hospitable. I mean, I was truly welcomed into that community. After we identified the author and artist that we wanted to sort of center in this project, and I'll talk about them in a moment, we planned for them to come out to Philadelphia because both of them came from different tribal identities. Lee Francis, who is the author, is of the Laguna Pueblo. So he knows Southwestern culture, the issues that really face those peoples. And Washoyo Alvitre is of the Tongva, south of California. And both of them, I thought it was crucial that they not only get a sense of the collections that were inspiring this, but a sense of the people. So we wanted to make sure they had a chance to meet with our advisory team, to make connections, and to connect with local Native peoples on the ground through the Circle Legacy Center. And I'll talk more about that a little later. So we had, yes, time in archives. You can see the image of Washoyo and Lee looking at some political cartoons, me showing off some manuscript at the Lancaster History Archive, and also of the wampum collection at the American Philosophical Society. And wampum figures very largely in this graphic novel. But we also went out to the space. We rented a van and we went to what was the site of Conestoga Indian Town. We visited the Fulton Theater, which was the site of the Lancaster Jail. And we met with the Circle Legacy Center and had a potluck. And we flew people out a couple of times so we could build those relationships. Because again, it takes time to build those relationships, especially when an institution like the Library Company is driving that project. The teacher seminar sort of happened on a similar track. The teacher seminar was co-organized with the University of Pennsylvania, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And this was crucial because GLI, Gilder Lehrman, they have deep relationships with public high school teachers all over the country. And so they helped us to recruit a truly national survey of public school teachers that could participate in this course. And so we had them out over the summer. They came out, they got to see the archival materials, they got to see early pages of the graphic novel, and they got to, really think through and put pressure on some of the decisions we were making about the graphic novel in terms of what would make it most compelling for that secondary education audience. So a couple of images there. The outcome, one of the outcomes, I should say, of those teachers visiting is that they contributed, about a third of the teachers contributed lesson plans as they integrated the graphic novel into their classrooms. But those lesson plans came later. So it was too late for us to fold those into the book, and we had very real material constraints on what we could jam into that book. We only had so many pages, but the digital edition could accommodate that. And so all of those lesson plans, ranging from actually primary school all the way through like AP courses, high school, are all on Ghost River. And since then, I routinely talk to students. Washoyo and Lee often join me if their schedules permit. And we get to see how the students continue to ask different questions of this. One project, you'll see a sort of illustration in the top corner. That's from students who were responding to reading the graphic novel and the political cartoons at the Library Company and thinking about the kinds of political cartoons they themselves would create. As sort of a counter narrative. That was at the Shipley School, which has since adopted Ghost River into its core curriculum. But this brings us to the graphic novel. And I'll talk mostly about it as a print edition, but I also want to stress, and I'll show you in a moment, that it is available in an online format that you can access right now. The print edition has been through 2 editions. We probably got a 3rd one coming up because we've exhausted our 4,000 copies, which is a good problem to have. It's basically split in 2. This is what it looks like. It's just a little guy. It's designed to be very affordable. We want to keep the cost down, sell it at cost to teachers, distribute it freely wherever funds allow. It's already circulating in a bunch of different libraries, but it's basically split into 2 components. The graphic novel, the actual sequential art, and then all of the, I guess you'd say the interpretive apparatus, the contextual materials. Those include artist statements, contextual essays, reproductions of the primary source materials that either appear explicitly in the graphic novel or implicitly, as well as a teacher's unit developed by the Gilder Lehrman Institute. So that's separate from the lesson plans that were created by the students. And finally, an annotated script, but I'll show you that in a moment. The digital edition you can access right now, and it's totally free, and we intend to keep it that way. And it makes this graphic novel available in multiple permutations. You can download it as a PDF, as an EPUB file, if you've got a crappy broadband connection. But you can also view it through your browser. And that enriched version of the graphic novel allows you to then click these little information buttons that bring up other contexts. Those could be video clips of conversations with the creative team, primary source materials that we drew upon, and even contextual essays. So those are integrated, woven into the fabric of that digital edition. They, of course, include all the lesson plans that were created after the fact by the Gilder Lehrman educators, interviews with all the Circle Legacy Center folks, that we met with on 4 different occasions, I think, in the course of creating this graphic novel. Essays and lesson plans from project interns that we had at the library company. And finally, and I think kind of importantly, a documentary film that was created by a great group of filmmakers at Mangrove Media. They followed us around for a lot of the research process. And so that film is really our documentation of what went into making this thing. Now, in terms of the actual graphic novel, I want to draw out a few different themes. And this is something where, ideally in the future, we'll have Lee and Wes Shoyo out, and they can speak much more eloquently about this. But I want to just sort of tease them out. And it strikes me that I didn't fully introduce Lee and Wes Shoyo. Lee Francis, he has a doctorate in education, so he's thought a lot about educational materials, and he's written a lot of non-sequential art. Graphic novels, comics. He's sort of created Native American comic space such that it exists today. He's the founder of Indigenous Comic-Con, and he runs Red Planet Books and Comics, which is not only a brick and mortar shop, the only one that we know of, where you can buy Native art, or pop art, I should say, but also serves as a publisher. So Native folks can take control of their representation, so they don't have to go through Marvel and DC and see whatever comes out the other end. Wes Shoyo is an independent artist who works often with Lee. So that was part of the appeal of having them work together, that they already had a tight working relationship. And she's worked with the Smithsonian on a number of historical reinterpretation projects. She does beautiful artwork, and she does it all in old-fashioned Bristol board. So none of this is digital. It's scanned after the fact. She uses 11 by 17 Bristol board. She researched the pigments that would have been available in the 18th century. She used a 19th century gold nib to do all of the line work. She gets really into the materiality. And this image really helps you get a sense of the care with which she pursues her art, the great deal of detail that goes into it. But I think it's also important because this is the first image of the graphic novel. It is the opening spread. And so that's it right there. And the whole point of starting here with a Haudenosaunee origin story is that it sets us on Native time. This isn't about the Paxton boys. It's not narrowly about settler colonialism. It's about Native peoples that lived here and the way that they continue to live here in a way that far precedes contact, right? And I think what's also really compelling about this image, and this is the origin story of Turtle Island, which is shared by a number of different groups along the Mid-Atlantic region, is that she's particularized it in ways that I think are really powerful. You'll see, I wonder if I can draw attention. These little artifacts in the black around the Turtle Island, those are petroglyphs. Those are actual petroglyphs that we researched that are on the Susquehanna River. We worked with an archaeologist out there to identify all of the various petroglyphs along that river and to integrate them. So this localizes this more generalized myth and really starts the story there. I think Wes Shoyo must have spent like 2 weeks on this one spread. It was an incredible amount of labor. I think what's also important here is that this isn't just a story about the past, and it's not just a story about us as readers or us as a creative team, but the Native peoples who live and continue to live in the Lancaster area. So this is a scene from a 250th commemoration that happened back in 2013. And these are actual living people that Weshoyo has illustrated from the Circle Legacy Center. And each of them is reading a name of one of the Conestoga who was murdered. So it brings the past into contact with the present. It gives the past a voice, a presence, right, inside of the graphic novel. And it also gives recognition to the Circle Legacy folks that were so generous to us. Weshoyo does a lot with using the colonial print culture. You'll see that she embeds pamphlets, she embeds political cartoons, but she also finds a sort of native correlative to this, which is wampum. That's jewelry, often like belts, chokers, that were made to commemorate diplomatic efforts, and they're made out of quahog shell. It's an incredibly laborious, time-consuming process. And there are beautiful belts all over the place, and they have great weight. I'll talk more about that a little later. But what Weshoyo has done in both of these images, you have a spread and then a later image, is that she's used wampum to mediate the violence of the Paxton vigilantes against the Conestoga. Remember, our concern was twofold here in terms of presenting the violence of this story. We wanted to be honest about it, but we also didn't want to fetishize it. We also had to be, cognizant of the fact that, we wanted this book to be accessible to middle school students, high school students. So what Weshoyo has done is she has literally embedded the attack on Conestoga Indian Town in that wampum belt that's held by that Native woman. And it's abstracted through the beadwork. And you'll see here and elsewhere, the Paxtons never have faces. They're always silhouettes. Again, decentering their presence where they've gotten so much elsewhere. The other image, which is a scene of that one black bead, is actually in a series of really powerful sequences that shows the attack on the Lancaster jail. And what happens is it keeps panning out, panning out, panning out. It's almost cinematic in nature. And then it leaves you with that one missing, or that one black bead. And that comes to represent this incident. Again, what she's really doing here is deconstructing the figures into individual beads that were once connected that then get rent. Relatedly, we have Lenape folks that are presented as active agents, both in the historical narrative, but also in the sort of contemporaneous narrative that's happening simultaneously. Because again, this is a narrative that's sort of elliptical in nature. It includes deep history, like the very origin story of the continent. It includes, scenes from the 18th century, but it also includes the research process. It includes the 250th commemoration. It includes this scene from the Pennsylvania Art Museum, where we have a native culture keeper problematizing, I think is the right term, problematizing the mythology that's encapsulated in Penn's treaty, that Benjamin West painting that a lot of people associate with this mythology of Penn's peaceable kingdom. Again, this was all made. The actual artwork, the referent, was made after the American Revolution. So, I mean, this is after the American Revolution. It's after the Paxton affair. This is a dream. And this figure that we have cast puncturing that mythology is Curtis Zuniga. He was our representative from the Delaware tribe of Indians, who was really indispensable in connecting us with the folks at the Circle Legacy Center and also other folks at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. So we have integrated him into the book. In another scene, you see this is back in Philadelphia with the interned Lenni Lenape, where you have a Native person challenging a colonial figure about the representation, their representation in these political cartoons, saying, this isn't who we are. So again, that would never be visible if we were relying specifically on the archival materials. Those materials aren't collected. But this is really telegraphing a conversation that emerged in the archives with Weshoyo and Lee. And that brings us to the integration of the research process. As I mentioned, we had these research trips, these field trips. In this one page, you could see Weshoyo and Lee talking about the visual culture material that they're looking at and saying, like, this this is an insane way to represent these people. This is so flattening. And so their frustration is echoed historically by the Lenni Lenape who contested in that previous image. But you can also see them interacting with the space out in Lancaster or in that county, including the previous site of the Conestoga Indian town. And finally, on the far side, you have an image from the Mennonite Church, which is where we met with the Circle Legacy Center for 2 of the potlucks that we had. And those are actual folks that welcomed us with such hospitality, illustrated in the graphic novel. I'd mentioned earlier that we have an annotated script, and this is, I think, a really wonderful thing that was new to me. I was introduced to this through the world of graphic arts, and this is apparently not uncommon, but the idea is you sort of show your work. You show whom you consulted with, how you made the decisions that you made. And so this goes page by page, and it collects all of the correspondence that we had, be it through text messages, Google Chat, email. It collects it page by page, and it gives you a sense of the conversations that we had. It's not totally comprehensive, but it's pretty darn close. And so, for example, you could see on page 7, it's accompanied with the ink version of the page. Elsewhere, you can see the thumbnails of the page. So you could sort of see the graphic novel emerging in that process. But alongside it, you could see whom we consulted with. Barry Lee of the Circle Legacy Center, Dan Richter, author of Facing East from Indian Country, and also an advisor on the project. So again, the point was to open this process up as much as possible so that people could see how we made the decisions that we did have to make. This brings us to the consultation, and this is sort of a delicate process because I think we did a lot right here, but there's more room for growth. There's more room for work. I'm going to talk about both of those. In terms of consultation, I thought we had a superb advisory board. We had leadership from the Free Library of Philadelphia, the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, of course, Dan Richter at the McNeil Center, Curtis Zuniga of the Delaware Tribe, and Ron Nash from the Gilder Lehrman Institute. You know, these are really senior, generous people that also served as ambassadors for the project, not only supporting its development, but really helping to get it out into the world. We also had a number of really generous outside readers, some of whom were academics and some of whom were Native folks, that really helped look at different iterations of the graphic novel and to ask questions and to make sure that we were being as honest as we could be. And then, of course, you know, the sort of raw numbers don't really give you a sense of the humanity. So I would encourage you to look at the acknowledgements page, which lists everyone that was involved. But we had folks from various cultural heritage centers involved. We had lots of folks from higher ed. We had, of course, all the folks from the Circle Legacy Center, which was that informal group in Lancaster. And then we had all the teachers, which again were really integral in helping to get this book out into the world. But this brings us to a challenge that we face in the Mid-Atlantic, and it might not be as much of a challenge here, I don't know. But because of forced removal, the partners that we needed were physically nowhere near us. There are no federally or state recognized tribes in Pennsylvania. So the Circle Legacy Center, they were incredibly generous, and they were recommended by Curtis over at Delaware Tribe. But we don't know if they really have the cultural authority, the backing of all the other Lenape peoples. And while I reached out to 3 of these groups, only one of the federally recognized tribes, the Delaware Tribe, got back to me, which raises an issue. I mean, the Muncie Delaware Nation and the Stockbridge Muncie community, both, I didn't even know to consult them. I didn't know that that was something that we should be doing. And of course, we also had the exigencies of the grant. Like all of this had to be accomplished in 2 years. So we had a sort of ticking clock. But if I were thinking about a sort of perfect version of this, it would be one that really involved consultation with all 5 of these federally recognized tribes. But one of the things I've been working on with a representative from Delaware Nation, not the Delaware Tribe, but Delaware Nation, Caitlin Lucas, is thinking about systematically what we can do to facilitate this kind of consultation. Because, you know, there are very real issues with folks speaking on behalf of the Lenni Lenape and not having the cultural authority, not having the best interests of the federally recognized tribes at heart. And, There was recently, I've got a image here from a conference that was hosted at MSU about pretendians being a real issue, where you have people claiming Native heritage, speaking with some kind of authority on it, and being taken literally. And so there is a very real challenge, I think, for folks working in the Mid-Atlantic in particular, where there is forced removal, about knowing who do you contact, how do you scope out, and then understanding that all of these federally recognized tribes are operating on shoestring budgets. They have their own commitments. They might not be able to answer with any kind of regularity. They might not ever answer, And so one of the, sort of blue sky ideas that Caitlin Lucas has that I love to talk about is this idea of a Lenape press, a sort of intrastate, if we're thinking about these as nation states, intrastate group that would basically allow Lenape folks to take control of their representations by publishing their own narratives, but also serve as an entry point for scholars or creative practitioners that might want to do work with Lenape people and connecting them with representatives from all 5 nations. So I think there's a lot more work to do there, and I don't have good answers on that. What I can speak to, though, is that this was a really difficult project, but I think a really important one to take on at the Library Company of Philadelphia. That image that you see there, that's another Benjamin West image, and it's of the original Library Company when it was over at like 3rd and Walnut. It's since moved a couple of times, but it has that very strange statue above the doorway. That's Benjamin Franklin in a toga. We've retained that statue for some curious reason. But the Library Company is sort of an improbable place to have a role in this. It's one of the oldest colonial institutions in America. It was founded by Franklin 291 years ago. And before it became a successful lending library, really creating the template for public libraries across America, it was a small library that basically doubled in size thanks to the donations of James Logan, who made a great deal of money on the walking purchase hoax. So there's a complicated history there. And yet I want to believe, perhaps naively, that the individuals who work at these institutions, the leadership that's involved in these institutions, can change them, can challenge that history, can make them better. And that's really where I want to stop with the public art exhibition. You'll see Franklin and his toga there on the far left. And this was a first for us because we actually, in a way, put him in the background. Normally, there's nothing on the windows, but with this exhibition, we decided to integrate some artwork as canvases over all the glass facade to really open up the Library Company to people that be walking on the street. We propped the doors open. So it was the highest attended exhibition in recent memory, at least. And of course, those names in front of Franklin, those are the names of the Conestoga. And we've superimposed them, putting those names into the foreground and him into the background, which is a pretty radical act for an institution like the Library Company. Also radical, it wasn't just about old books, old pamphlets. It was actually about the artwork of the graphic novel. So this is the first Native art exhibition that the Library Company has hosted in that 291-year history. And it put that artwork in beautiful frames on the walls. And instead of foregrounding the archival materials, those were the context through which you read the artwork that was all over the walls. It included multimedia, including that video that walked folks through the process. And notably, it also included a commissioned piece. That is a wampum bracelet in that bottom corner image alongside the pamphlets. That was created by Elizabeth James Perry, who is a Wampanoag artist. She does all of this by hand. And so she actually created a wampum bracelet. We have the quahog shell to give you a sense of where it was derived from. And now that is a permanent part of the Library Company's collection. And, emerging from this as probably the most successful exhibition the Library Company's put on, through all of the sales of the books, the Library Company started to do things differently too, thinking differently about what a research fellowship can look like and how to open up that space, that it's not just the early Americanists, but also creative practitioners and Native folks that might feel that they could contribute. And I could talk more about that, but I want to end with a couple of calls to action. If you like what you've seen today, I encourage you to explore Ghost River and to share it with friends or colleagues who you think might enjoy it. If you want a print copy, and I've got this one I can send circulating, you can get it through the library company, but I say get it through Red Planet Books and Comics, so that the money goes directly back to the Native creative practitioners. And of course, follow Lee and Weshoyo's work, because they have done so many wonderful projects since. They're feverishly busy. And so I would encourage you to look them up. They're both on social media, and they also have very active projects that are really exciting.